Welcome to the Moonflower Path podcast. This space is for the highly sensitive, the creatives, the earth-loving, the caregivers, the weirdos, the feelers, the change makers, and dreamers of the world. Here, we are all about guiding you to trust your body intuition so you can find home and shift culture. Through the exploration of somatic practice, self-care, and seasonal ritual, my hope is that you will be inspired to be in harmony with yourself and in a dance with the earth. I'm your host, Carolyn, and I'm so honored and grateful to be here with you today. Hello, lovely listener, and welcome back to the podcast. Welcome to my I'm sitting in the dark in my closet vibes. That seems to be the most common advice around getting good sound for podcast recording. And honestly, my highly sensitive self is really loving this. Sitting in the dark in my closet is actually something that I do on a regular basis, more during the summer. And if you've been part of my community, then you've heard me mention that before. And it's something that we'll probably talk more a little bit more during the brighter seasons of the year. But yeah, just like picture me sitting on the floor in my closet, literally on my folded clothes, and just sharing these words with you. Also, my golden doodle Nala, which you may have seen if you've practiced with me on YouTube before, is super duper confused as to what's going on. Anyways, just wanted to paint the picture for you. So welcome. If you are coming back after having listened to the last few episodes, welcome to episode 3. And if you're new here, because of course, as the podcast grows, there will be new folks coming into this space, into this community. If you're new here, welcome. Thank you for being here, whether you're new or you're regular. I am really, really thankful for your time, for your support, and I'm really looking forward to diving into today's episode. But if you haven't had a chance to listen to last week's episode, please do make sure to give it a listen, as I shared a bit more about the beginning of my own self-care journey, kind of the first chapter of navigating panic attacks that forced me to quit my job, as well as ways that you can gently learn to prioritize caring for your body in your own life. But today's episode being called Somatic Practice, Self-Care, and Ritual, how they can each support you. Today's episode is a lot less personal and a lot more practical, I hope. If we're going to be talking about somatic practice, self-care, and ritual in this space, in this community, I want to take the time to define each of these terms so that we're all on the same page. This will be a helpful episode if you're new to these terms and if you're curious about how it might apply to you or support you as a sensitive, creative, and earth-loving soul. So we'll start with somatic practice. Also, I would like to say before we dive in, before we jump in, I would like to say that I'm, as much as I am the guide in this space, I'm also a student of all of the lessons that I share with you here, right? We're in conversation here together. So I would like to say that I am still learning about all of these different things. I am constantly taking in new information, reading the books, listening to the podcast, taking the courses. And so I just wanted to say that here, that the things that I'm going to say in this space, and always for that matter, are really my take, my view, my own personal experience with these practices and with these concepts. But really, you are your best guide here. So take what feels right, leave what doesn't, and by all means, take part in the conversation if there's any questions that you have or any suggestions that you have or any I don't really know about that, Carolyn. My inbox is always open. You can send me a message on Instagram or send me an email. All of that info is on my website. Okay, somatic practice. So this is the beginning, in my opinion. If self-care is defined as mentioned in last week's episode, the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health, then to implement self-care effectively, one must first commit to the practice. Practice is defined as to perform an activity or exercise, a skill, repeatedly or regularly in order to improve or maintain one's proficiency. Somatic is defined as relating to the body. Okay, so if we take a look at those definitions, more specifically practice and self-care, the regularity of it is crucial. Of course it would be, though, if you think about it, right? So in order to implement self-care into your life effectively, you must first be a beginner. It begins with inquiry, with compassionate awareness, with learning new skills, new tools, new ways of being, thinking, and moving. It begins with surrendering to who you naturally are. And in order to do that, there's also the process of unlearning learned ways of being that aren't healthy or supportive. It's a lot of new. And when you practice something for the first time, you are inevitably a beginner. And in order to transition from a beginner to someone who is more proficient, one must practice. And also, I'd just like to highlight that I said someone who is more proficient, because if we think about this somatic practice, or if we think about more specifically in my world, yoga, I mean, to become a master of yoga, like, is that really what we're here for? Is that really the point? The whole business, this whole community is rooted on the truth that there really isn't an end goal here. That is why this is the Moonflower Path and not the Moonflower, I don't know, destination or the Moonflower. I don't know, what would be the thing at the end of a path? The top of the mountain. I don't know. So I would just like to really highlight that yes, you start as a beginner, but really maybe we're just like always a beginner. We're always the student. Maybe we become also a teacher, but both and, right? Both and. We can be a teacher as well as a student. You can wear both of those hats. So we're talking specifically here about somatic practice. So the practice of embodiment, of feeling safe at home in your body. So you can attune to your body's needs. And attunement is something that we'll unpack, that we'll explore a little bit more in weeks to come. But that isn't easy if you've never done it before, right? To feel safe and at home in your body, as well as to attune to your body's needs. It's not easy if you're new to this concept. And when you're practicing being in your body in ways that are unfamiliar, it is crucial to do it in spaces that feel comforting and safe. This is something we will explore much more in depth in next week's episodes, but for now, let's define that somatic practice is the practice of coming home to yourself. So for the purpose of being as clear as possible, I would describe somatic practices as the things that you set aside time to do in your schedule on a somewhat regular basis that act as a sort of anchor in your routine in your day-to-day schedule, such as your meditation practice, your journaling practice, your creative practice, your morning routine, or mindful movement-based practices like yoga, dance, qigong, etc. Practices where you can get messy, be curious, fall apart, make mistakes, and know that you're still held and safe always. I like to kind of illustrate these as practices where, yes, you set aside time, but it's almost like your past self is setting your future or present self up for success. So carving out the time, setting up boundaries around coming back to this space, making it as easy as you can to show up, to step onto your mat, to sit on your meditation cushion, to pull out your creative tools, whatever they may be, to make your way into the kitchen, to bake or to cook as you know that you like to do as a somatic practice. So to reiterate these practices, in order for them to be beneficial and truly impactful, in my experience, benefit from being scheduled in one way or another. Setting the time aside in advance, creating an anchor in your life. Then it becomes a sacred container where you are held exactly as you are, your beautifully messy self, where you can be a humble student, make mistakes, try new things, get weird, all while being reminded of how worthy and enough you are and coming home to yourself. Okay, so we move on to somatic self-care. So you're now familiar with the words somatic and self-care as defined in the last category. So how might this differ from the previous category? Well, my take, I'd say that somatic self-care is less a practice, less a regular safe space. It could be, but it's more of a tool, a resource, or a skill that you can turn to at any given notice depending on what your body needs. Again, it's putting the body at the forefront literally always. So in my experience, over time, a somatic practice can turn into somatic self-care when it no longer always feels like a practice and feels like a solid tool you can pull out of your symbolic somatic self-care toolkit. Examples of these are like endless. I mean, we know about the self-care buzzwords, but for clarity's sake, here are some examples that we will explore further in this space and that you could begin to explore now, or maybe you're really already familiar with and you'll recognize some. Breathing exercises are always the first thing that come to mind, right? You might either do these in your somatic practice within the safety, the container of your practice, where you learn this new breathing exercise and then you do it a few more times and it begins to feel like something that's really supportive. And then it becomes a somatic self-care tool that you come to, that when you're out and about in life, like personal example is if I'm walking on the street and things are just really loud, there's buses rushing by, there's just, hustle and bustle of life. If I place my hand on my belly and I take 3 deep breaths where I'm inhaling on a count of 4 and exhaling on a count of 5, just 3 of those deep breaths are incredibly helpful. And that's something that has become an automatic thing, but it first started as something that I learned within the container of practice. Any learning resources that help support you, such as podcasts, books, radio, movies, again, that enable you to feel at home in your body in every sense of the term. So this is where you get to use your ability to discern between the resources where you're taking in content just for the sake of taking in content as a way of escapism or distracting or procrastinating or pulling you away from things that you really would like to be doing, or it is taking in content, taking in resources that are actually enhancing your ability to feel at home in your body. Items you might use in your life to help your self-care practice, like placing a crystal up against your heart, essential oils on the palm of your hand, soothing music, plushy blankets. You get the idea. Setting boundaries, mantras or affirmations, spending time with friends who make you feel loved, spending time in nature. I feel like that should be number 1. So these resources, these tools, all have essences of them that pull from what you get from your somatic practice. It's like you take the comfy home vibes that you feel when you're in practice, and you can now take them with you when you're out and about in life. doesn't necessarily have to only be when you're out and about in life. Maybe it's you're at home and you're like, oh man, I know this is really going to help me. I'm going to do this thing because I know it's really what I need right now. But really, being a feeler, being highly sensitive, being creative, or a caring earthly human, earth goddess, a big caring individual, you want to live life fully and openly and beautifully, right? I know that. But the world isn't always made for you. So to have somatic self-care that you can turn to in any given moment can help you feel supported and aligned, and it's just such a valuable thing. And then we come to somatic ritual. This is where I see both the previous categories come together to create magic. I also believe that ritual is a word that is being reclaimed from us earth-living folk. Because even if the definition of the word a ritual is described as a religious or solemn ceremony consisting of a series of actions performed according to a prescribed order. It's like such a dry, definitions usually would be, but it's just like such a dry definition, right? That we can feel like the oppressive religions and patriarchy seeping in that definition. And religion is a touchy subject. So in this space, I'd like to make it clear that in no way am I ever trying to impose my beliefs on you in a controlling way. Everything I share in this space comes from nature's wisdom, as well as my own experience, and also the research that I've done and the teachers that I have. And I try my very best to ensure I am not sharing or practicing rituals that are culturally appropriative. But if at any point you feel like I am, please call me out. I'm open and always ready to learn more. So with that said, let's get into somatic ritual as it pertains to this community space. A somatic ritual is a somatic practice and somatic self-care, right? The last 2 points I just talked about that have it's almost like it's like graduated to become a somatic ritual. A ritual has a magical, sacred component to it, a certain comforting order to it. Rituals can be passed down to you from ancestors, from hundreds or thousands of years back, or they might be something that you've created for yourself in your own life. They can be strict, long, and rigid, if that's like your jam. If you're like, oh, I really want to stick to tradition, beautiful. They can have many steps to follow, all of it. Or they can also be spacious and flowy and creative. In Isla McLeod's book, Rituals for Life, she mentions that there are 4 seeds to ritual: intention, creativity, gratitude, and kindness. That certainly is a beautiful way of exploring and creating ritual. And there's also space for you to have your own seeds, your own take on it. It truly could be anything. Maybe your yoga practice has now become a ritual of sorts, or your morning routine, your morning somatic self-care has now become a ritual that helps you celebrate the transition from night to day. In my experience, the magic is also found in the recognition of something greater than ourselves being at play. There's this element of grace, whether that be connecting to the universe, source, Mama Earth, your guides, angels, God, whatever. There's space offered for spirit to enter into your heart, into your body, into the ritual, into your space, and be with you as you explore the ritual. In this community, we have created ritual around the rhythms and cycles found in the natural world. Rituals have been created around the seasonal transitions and cycles of the moon. These rituals can include many components. In my seasonal rituals resources I offer in my newsletters, which you can register for in the show notes, usually include a recipe using ingredients easily found in that season, a meditation to honor the seasonal transition, some journal prompts, a tarot card spread, and or a yoga practice to enjoy. We also come together. We come together around the Wheel of the Year celebrations, and we gather as a community And by doing this year after year, because we've been doing this, if you're new here, we've been doing this for over 2 years, and we will continue to explore these seasonal rituals. And by doing them year after year, season after season, the repetitiveness of it creates that sacredness, and it creates the ritualistic component. There definitely is a theme here of celebrating the sacredness of transitions, which is quite common in rituals if you explore rituals in every culture. Rites of passage, almost. So that's also something to make note of. So let's bring it back to here, this space, this community. This is somatic, which I believe adds a beautiful dose of grounding to something that could possibly feel quite ethereal. To explore the relationship or connection between your body within the context of somatic or seasonal ritual is a really honoring experience. We've gone through all the different categories, and I did want to mention before we sign off, and also before we reflect, that honestly the word I will use usually to lump all these categories into one moving forward is somatic self-care, just because it kind of sounds the best, and it's simpler than saying all three all at the same time. But as we move forward, the episodes will usually focus on 1 out of 3. So I just wanted to mention that. But I just wanted to add a little level of reflection and inquiry to kind of wrap us up here. So now that we've explored all of these categories, what has come up for you? What have you noticed? What components are you just like, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting. I didn't know that. Or yeah, I'm really familiar with that. Are there any categories that you are super comfortable in? Is there a category that you're curious about learning more of? I just wanted to keep that open-ended so that you can reflect on what your relationship is with these words that I've shared of somatic practice, self-care, and ritual. I would love to hear a little bit more about your somatic practices, self-care, and rituals. You can send me an email. You can comment on the post associated with this podcast episode release. And let's continue the conversation, because again, like I've said, we are in conversation together. We are creating this community of moonflowers together. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Moonflower Path podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn, and ways that you can find more support from me and this cozy community are all found in the show notes. Please consider rating and reviewing this podcast and sharing it with a friend. Those are the best ways to show your support for this free and accessible resource. Wishing you a gentle rest of your day, and I look forward to connecting again with you very soon.